The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just wanted to let you guys know we're going to get started on time in about 2 minutes. So we will give it 2 more minutes to let people join. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for joining us today. Before I hand it over to the presenters, just a few housekeeping notes. We will have all attendees on mute for the entire duration of the webinar. At the end, we will open it up for question and answer period. And at that time, you can raise your hand on the GoToWebinar portal. I will unmute your mic and you can ask your question. So at this time, we are going to officially start our webinar, and I'm going to hand it on over to Russ Anderton.
Thank you, Jordan. I want to welcome everyone. We've got just, I guess, a little bit of housekeeping. So if you want to ask a question, you can simply type that in on your interface. We'll be monitoring those throughout and answer most of those probably at the end of the session, unless there's something we feel like is relevant as we're partway into it. So quick introductions. I'm Russ Anderton and have been involved with this industry for many, many years. I'm a mechanical engineer and spent the first half of my career in the engineering design part of this industry, and now the last half of the career in the asset management maintenance portion of the industry, including many years around Maximo and also MOCs. Rebecca?
Hi, I'm a senior business process consultant for Cohesive, and I am currently working in MOC implementation in the oil and gas industry. Back
Very
to you,
good.
Beth.
Yep, go ahead and so what we're going to do today is primarily you're going to see a demonstration of what we're talking about here, right? Which is an MOC solution built on top of IBM's Maximo system. Prior to that, I've seen who's registered for this session, and about probably more than 50% of you are from the oil and gas industry. So you really don't need to know what's on this slide because you probably already know it. But for those of you who aren't, management of change really came out of at least here in the U.S., and I know there's a few folks on here outside the U.S., but in the U.S., this really evolved out of the OSHA process safety management regulations, and I've put a reference in here. By the way, this deck and a recording of this will be put up on our website by early next week. So anyone in your company who can't attend, you'll be able to easily access all this information starting early next week. But you'll see a reference here to the OSHA process safety management set of elements. If you were to go out there on number 13 to 14, you'd find the true definition, OSHA's definition of management of change, which is establish and implement written procedures managing change to process, chemicals, technology, equipment, and facilities. And that is what most people associate the formal MOC to. We have seen many organizations from a best practice standpoint also apply MOC to organizational and administrative changes. So that's something just as an FYI if you're not already thinking along those lines. And MOC is really focused on a review and approval process, including many times tracking the actions associated with an MOC. And that's, by the way, that's why we feel like it's best practice to have a tightly integrated MOC process with your work management, asset management system. In this case, of course, we're really talking about MOC being on the very same platform and therefore leveraging the existing work and asset management system. And you'll see that as we get into the demonstration. And last but not least, MOCs typically categorized as either permanent, temporary, or emergency changes. You can go ahead, Rebecca. Okay, now really why MOC? And again, many of you might already be familiar with this, but really the formal definition of management of change really came out of a series of accidents, and we've just listed a few of those here. But if you go out and look at the Process Safety Management website, you'll find that this is really mostly focused on industries that have worked and are working with hazardous chemicals or gas. However, it's also considered best practice for other industries. So if I'm an electric utility who may or may not really deal directly with hazardous chemicals or gas, many of these same concepts of management of change can still apply and do apply across other industries. Go ahead, Rebecca. Now what we're going to do is dive into the solution itself. With no further ado, that's kind of the background. So what you're going to be seeing here today is really where we have taken the IBM Maximo oil and gas industry solution, which some people also know by name as Maximo HSE for Health Safety Environment add-on. It's the same name for two slightly different modules. We've taken the management of change applications out of that industry solution and essentially provided some pre-configured templates, if you will, that really serve as an accelerator to an MOC implementation project. And specifically, when I say sort of pre-configurations, and I'm not going to go into great detail here because you're going to see these in the demonstration, but we've done some things around creating some workflows that we know will apply to 90% of the people who implement MOC. Obviously, we need to put your thumbprint on it and make alterations to this out-of-the-box workflow, if you will, or workflows to your specific scenarios at your company. But this is one of the things we've done to help accelerate. Similarly, we've done things in the area of user security and conditional logic, and also how you typically want to attach documents, which is very critical in an MOC scenario. Things like risk matrix and pre-safety startup requirements, checklists, things like this are typically attached to an MOC. But that's the essence of what you're going to be seeing. And then the last slide here, and we're going to dive right into the demo, is just, I wanted you to see the way this lays out sort of graphically, right? So you have core Maximo, and then that light blue ring really represents the industry solution that we just talked about. And this slide shows you just a high-level summary of all the different applications that are contained within the Maximo oil and gas industry solution. And then typically that outer ring would be, you know, configuration specific to your company. And in this case, we're going to be focusing only on the management of change applications that are a subset of the entire oil and gas industry solution and some of those sort of quote customer configurations that we've kind of already started for you. And that's about it in terms of an introduction. Feel free to type in any questions you might have there, but I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca, and you're going to be primarily hearing from her for the rest of our time together.
Oops, there was sweet baby James for a second. Thank you, Russ. So just want to give a little backstory before we actually dive into Maximo. So I'm going to base this demo on a backstory, sort of a situation that occurred, not in real life. This is just a story that we made up in order to give a good presentation. So we have a result from a root cause failure analysis on a high pressure compressor main bearing failure. So a recommendation that came out of that root cause failure analysis is that we need to increase the frequency of our PM maintenance inspection of our compressor anchor bolts. So that's just going to be the background on what has occurred and what is going to lead to the MOC. So I'm going to sign in as the MOC requester. So one of the things that we like to point out is that the setup for the MOC creation can begin with the MOC request, and this is out of the box functionality for Maximo. So just like service request, you can have multiple people in your organization have access to the MOC request, just like service request. And then that could be the initiation for an MOC record, is to come through an MOC request. So I've signed in as Dan Pastorini. So Dan Pastorini is going to initiate or kick off this MOC request. I do want to point out, just for those of you that are not very familiar with Maximo, just a few little things that's inherent with Maximo and highly configurable as well. So when Dan logs into Maximo, he goes to, he navigates to the Start Center. At his login, he then sees his Start Center. And on his Start Center, we've added a few portlets. That's the Maximo terminology for what we're looking at, this dashboard that we're looking at. So Dan sees a few things associated with the MOC and MOC request. So he has the ability to quickly create an MOC request or to navigate, and then he has some key performance indicator dashboard and also some result sets. But mostly I want to point out that his inbox and assignments, because we've worked to create a generic workflow, but it's a compilation of having worked with several clients and sort of seeing a pattern within their workflow requirements around MOC and MOC request. So I'm going to go ahead and, acting as Dan Pastorini, I'm going to go ahead and create the new MOC request. So Dan's going to fill out this MOC request record, and I've kind of taken a couple little shortcuts because nobody wants to watch me type a bunch of stuff in. So I'm going to go ahead and copy from a notepad the description of the request. So he would enter the description of the request, and then he would decide what type of process or workflow this is going to, this particular request is going to be. We have the options of emergency, permanent, and temporary. In this case, we're going to look at a permanent change to some documentation. So Dan also noticed that Maximo has auto-populated the originator or the initiator, whatever verbiage or terminology we want to use there, we can. So Dan's going to identify the sponsor. In this case, it's going to be Bum Phillips, and Dan knows Bum Phillips's ID, so he identifies Bum as the sponsor for the MOC request. That will be the reviewer who will determine if we're going to turn this into an MOC. Then Dan's going to identify the asset associated with this request. I do want to point out that when I entered my asset information, Maximo goes ahead and identifies the information associated with that asset. That's one of the, as Russ pointed out, that's one of the benefits of using Maximo for your MOC request and MOC process, is that your assets and locations, your work history, all that kind of information is already there in your existing Maximo data if you're already using Maximo. And so it's a nice tie-in that allows us to incorporate that data and keep that data all in one place. Everybody knows that when you have an auditor come in, the faster you can get to the data they're asking for, the better off you are. So having it all in one place is definitely a bonus here. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my notepad and pick up my scope. So you would identify what is the scope of this change. And in this case, Dan is identifying that he wants to have the current maintenance instructions or maintenance plan for this asset updated. So that way we have a description of what the scope is of this work. The next thing I want to point out is that we can have fields display or not display depending on values that we select in certain fields, typical out-of-the-box configuration within Maximo. So in this instance, the MOC type is going to be engineering and projects. And notice that when I identified engineering and projects, that displayed more fields, and those are identified or associated with that type of MOC. So we can have different fields display or not display depending on how we populate certain fields. We're going to also identify what kind of category. That's another typical data point that organizations identify with MOC records. So we could have this be a compliance issue, a risk issue, or a value issue. In this case, we're going to say that this particular MOC request is more of a value category than the other three. Now, another standard out-of-the-box Maximo functionality that I want to point out is, in this case, I have a rather lengthy justification that I'm going to populate, but first I'm going to put a shorter description here in the justification box. But then notice I say see more details in the long description. So I'm going to go ahead and populate the longer description here. Notice it's rich text, and for some reason it's just not formatting the way I like to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little more formatting. Typical rich text functionality that we could use. So we could use bullets, we could have links in here, things like that. All right, so I've put in my justification, I've put in my scope. We do have the ability to add documents, to attach documents, typical out-of-the-box Maximo functionality, adding documents. I'm just wanted to point that out. I'm going to leave that for now. Some other things that we've noticed with our typical clients is that oftentimes they have within their process, not necessarily within the software. So this is a tab that we added as much for demo purposes as anything else, is to show that we can take that process that you have for screening whether an MOC request should be created or not, and you can actually put it into the software, or you could leave this out and just keep this as part of the external to Maximo process. But in this case, we just wanted to show you that we could add this tab. So what Dan Pastorini kind of went through in the process to determine if he needed to create a MOC request was that he answered the question, is there a change to a controlled document? He answered yes. And he also, under the maintenance question, is there a change to a routine task? He said yes. And he also identified that because of the increase to the routine tasks, that there may also be an increase or a decrease in operating costs. So he answered yes to enough of the questions, and it could be just that if you answer yes to any one of the questions that in your organization, that would then determine that an MOC request needed to be created. So we've brought that process into the software. It definitely doesn't have to live here. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the log tab, because at this point, Dan Pastorini has completely filled out everything we need to have filled out in the MOC request. So at this point, he's identified his sponsor, and he knows that a workflow assignment is now going to go to the sponsor. I want to point out that we have in the workflow process, an email has now gone from Dan Pastorini to Bum Phillips, letting Bum know that there's an MOC request that he needs to come and look at. So now I'm going to log out as Dan Pastorini, and I'm going to log in as Bum Phillips. Notice that Bum Phillips now has this assignment on the in the inbox on the Start Center. So Bum would come in, click on that assignment, and then go do the review, look at the scope, look at the justification, know that there is a long description associated with it, maybe look at the screening questions, and then Bum may also want to come add a work log. So just for recording thoughts or recording different points of view from this request. So we have a log that we've added, and we're also going to now look, and we're going to go ahead and push this through workflow. I do want to point out that at this point, this MOC request is identified or statused at submitted. So now when I click the workflow, I have some options, and this again is built into that workflow, that generic workflow that we've built. So I could go back and ask the originator for more information. I could put this MOC request on hold. I could reject it, but at this point, I'm going to go ahead and accept this record. Notice that the status goes to approved. There's an email now out letting Dan Pastorini know that the sponsor has accepted the request. And Maximo has automatically created my MOC record for me. So now as the sponsor, I have a few more activities that I need to perform. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate over to that MOC record. So some of the things that as the sponsor I may be required, or part of the process that I may want to be a part of, is that I may need to populate things like the required date. When do we think that this should be required by? So I'm going to go ahead and just make it that first Friday in November, just because that seems like a really good date. And I'm also, I do want to point out the fields that have crossed over from the MOC request, the scope, the justification, category, the asset, things like that. And also over here on the log tab, that work log that's associated with this MOC request came over, and my screening questions came over. But over here, we're going to keep them in read only because we do not want those screening questions edited after they were submitted by the originator. So we want to keep that information at read only. And then on my related records tab, that MOC request is also related back or related to my MOC. So I have that both of that relationship defined in both records. Now, as the MOC sponsor or reviewing authority and creator, I would also then need to identify how this record is going to move forward in my organization. So I'm going to identify some information associated with how this workflow is going to go through the system. In this case, I'm going to identify a responsible leader or authoritative, a person in the authoritative role. I'm going to go ahead and pick Jeff Bagwell as that responsible leader. And some other things that I may need to do in association with this record right now is I may need to go ahead and identify where we stand as far as risk go in a preliminary. So where we stand today. So this is another thing that we've done is we have linked a risk matrix to this record or to the MOC process, because oftentimes organizations have a well thought out, well-defined risk matrix that they have in paper form and or have on a SharePoint or some other document drive. And so what I would do is I would come in and I would look at that risk matrix that my organization has created. I would identify, so this is an asset that was down, so it's either low or medium, but I'm going to say that because of the lack of inspection frequency or low inspection frequency, we are at medium risk. So I would use my matrix to come up with this value. And we're at low, medium, and high. So right now, actually, I'm going to go ahead and go with medium. Right now, we're at medium because we have asset failure occurring on occasion. Ooh. Of, we could say, once a month. All right, so we would have some kind of justification for our risk rating that coincides with what our defined risk matrix would give us. Also, I would probably be responsible for identifying any key impacts or areas of impact that may occur or may be impacted if we do not, or as we make this change. So definitely we're going to be making a change to a maintenance plan, and that is a controlled document. So I would identify that these are the areas that we're going to have impact when we make this change. So once I've done that, then I would go ahead and turn this record over to my responsible leader. So I'm going to click my workflow. And what I want to point out is that we've set the system up so that now I'm going to send an email to Jeff Bagwell, letting him know that I have identified him as the responsible leader for a new MOC record that is out there. So I just want to point out that under my workflow assignments, now Jeff Bagwell has that assignment. So now I'm going to go ahead and log out as Bum Phillips. And I'm going to log in as Jeff Bagwell. I do, again, want to point out that the different roles have different start centers. So you'll see different start center looks and feels along the way. Start center should be based on the role and the responsibilities within that role. So Jeff Bagwell is going to now click on that assignment. And start to look at the MOC record that's been assigned. One of the things that Jeff Bagwell may be interested in is whether this is a safety critical item or location, and if so, what are the safety critical elements associated with that location. What I want to point out is this is out of the box functionality in Maximo. We can change the behavior with configuration, but out of the box, safety critical is associated with the location. So on the location record, you identify if this location has safety critical elements, and then what are the safety critical element or elements with this location. So that's out of the box functionality. Some of our clients have used the out-of-the-box functionality, and then others have a safety critical element associated with the location, and then further they have an MOC safety critical element based at the MOC record. So you have both the location safety criticality and the MOC record safety criticality. We've worked with clients who have done it both ways. I just wanted to point out what out of the box functionality is in Maximo. So my responsible leader, Jeff Bagwell, would look at the information, look at the scope, the justification, the required date, would also start to look at maybe the screening questions, any log, work log information, what the key impacts are for this particular MOC record. And then based on that information, then Jeff would know what to do with this record. Okay, so I need to start defining what kind of actions are associated with this change. So on the definition tab, which by the way, out of the box, Maximo calls this pre-implementation. Post-implementation is the implementation tab, and then closure. So we've done some label changing as well, just based on how we hear this from clients out in the field. So Jeff Bagwell is very, very knowledgeable of the MOC process for his organization. And so he sort of already knows that he is going to have to have an action associated, here we go, with figuring out how much this is going to cost. And when he needs to have this action performed, he often assigns this to Bobby Brady. And he's going to give Bobby about, let's give Bobby a week to get this finished. All right. And also, we're going to need to have some documents updated. So we're going to have document updates required, and we're going to give this to Jan Brady. And we're going to give Jan the about a week to get this done as well. All right, so that's part of the definition actions. So these would be pre-implementation actions. These are the things that we need to get accomplished before we can decide whether we move forward with actually implementing the change or not. So in out-of-the-box Maximo, you have a PSSR or pre-start safety review tab that is part of the MOC record. We've worked with clients that keep this tab as part of an MOC, but then also use a also have a PSSR application where they do things, where they track actions associated with things like project PSSR activities or PSSR commissioning activities outside of the MOC world as well. That's a separate topic, but I did want to point out that that relationship is there, and we can take advantage of out-of-the-box Maximo functionality to clone and then use that same functionality in a standalone PSSR process as well. So in out-of-the-box Maximo, you get your PSSR review. So if this MOC, if this change has a PSSR requirement, we can track those separately in on this tab. This particular change does not have that, so we're going to go ahead and skip PSSR actions, but it works the same as definition, implementation, and closure actions. So Jeff's going to identify the implementation actions, or action in this case, associated with this change as well, so that we can go ahead when the reviewers and approver look at this record, they're going to see what we plan to do as they go through the review process. So Jeff's going to identify an action. And assign this action to Greg Brady. With, we're going to go ahead and put this at the end of October as a due date. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of time. So we're going to assign this action to Greg Brady. I'm wondering why my definition didn't show up, so I'm going to go ahead and save to see what I get. All right, so it's not seeing that as a acceptable value. So I'm going to just go ahead and pick one that it does. All right, there you go. I must have misread my number. The next thing that Jeff Bagwell is going to do is identify what are the actions for closing this record as well. So we're going to have a fully defined MOC. So we're going to have I know what I'm doing wrong. One moment. This is where I've set it up so I can show you what the group actions. So in the out-of-the-box Maximo, we have a standard actions application, and then we have the ability to group those actions together. So I've set this one up to show you the closure action. So we can have those predefined. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete 2 of those and keep this one and give this one to Marcia Brady. And we're going to have a closeout date. So our required date is November 2nd, so we're going to have a closeout date of the 1st. All right, so we have all of our actions defined, and we have a required date. So we're also going to go ahead and identify what would our risk value be if we do implement this change. So I do have the ability to navigate back over to my risk matrix, but I remember what it is. So it's going to be low, and I'm going to say that increased frequency will lower risk of failure in asset. All right, so I'm going to identify the new lower risk rating if we implement this change. So some of the last things that I'm going to do as Jeff Bagwell, or as the responsible person for this go around with the record, is I'm going to identify who are going to be the people who are going to review this change and this change record, and then start the approval process for it. Remember, Russ talked earlier about really MOC is a formalized or proceduralized review and approval of change. So this is where I would come in and I would identify who my reviewers are. So I'm going to pick James Harden, and I'm going to pick Beyonce Knowles as my reviewers. Now, one of the things that we've done in this environment is we have identified who can be the approvers in certain setups. So for certain assets or certain locations or certain MOC types and asset location combinations, we can say these are the people who can approve. So in this particular combination, Earl Campbell would be the person that would approve. So automatically, Earl Campbell is populated into that field. So those are some things also that we can do, is that we can filter list of individuals and have auto population of areas of responsibility based on those kind of combinations. And we can also just leave that open to the discretion of who is filling out the record. So all of those combinations can be something that we can work with your organization to identify and then make the system as automated as you want it to be. So now that Jeff Bagwell has populated this record and is ready for it to move forward, he's going to click the workflow icon and assign definition actions to the assignees. So we're going to put those definition actions out to my assignees. And what I want to point out for you is that once Jeff clicked that icon, 2 emails went out. One set of emails went out to the reviewers, letting them know that they have been identified as a reviewer and to be ready to review once they get the notification that they have been assigned to review. And then emails went out to my definition actionees, letting them know that they have actions to perform. And then in Maximo, the workflow assignments are out to Bobby Brady and Jan Brady. So when they log in, they'll have those assignments in their inboxes. So now I'm going to log out as Jeff Bagwell, and I'm going to log in as Bobby Brady. And so there's Bobby's. Notice his Start Center looks a little different. So here's Bobby's assignment. He clicks on his assignment and he goes to the definition tab because he was told he had a definition assignment. One thing I want to point out is that Bobby cannot populate Jan's assignment. We've put a conditional expression saying only the assignee logged in. So it looks at the logged in user and then tests that against the action by who's it assigned to, and says that only that person logged in can update the record. So cost estimate attached would be a comment. Bobby would have the ability to attach that cost estimate to this record. And then Bobby would click the workflow icon, identifying that that action is complete. And then at this point, I want to point out that the assignments are now just in Jan's box, but notice the workflow has not moved any further. So now Bobby's going to log out. And Jan's going to log in. And likewise, Jan's going to go and identify that her action is complete. And then move the record forward. So now the workflow assignment is in the reviewer's box, and they have received a second email indicating that it is time for them to come in and review. So I'm going to log out as Jan. And I'm going to log in as James Harden, who is one of the reviewers. So James Harden would come in, see this assignment. And because he's a reviewer, he needs to look at all of the information associated with this record. Needs to see what the definition actions were, that they were completed, what any comments, implementation, what are those actions, what are the closure actions, have the key impacts been identified correctly, are there any logs, all that kind of information, the screening questions. And once James Harden is happy with the record, then he would come in and sign off on the record and make a recommendation. This is an added field. This is not part of out of the box Maximo, but some of our clients have wanted to give each reviewer the ability to state whether they are accepting or giving some type of like level of acceptance for the record. Others just, as long as it's reviewed, that's fine. It just depends on what your organization needs. So once James Harden is happy with the record, he clicks the workflow. And I just want to point out that now it's waiting on Beyonce to clear her busy schedule and come look at our MOC record. So she logs in, goes to the assignment, follows the same path that James Harden would have followed. Look at all of the records, make sure she's super happy with what's going on with the record. And then she would identify that she is happy and that she recommends to proceed as well. Notice I did not have to open up the record to fill out the basic information. If she doesn't want to make a comment, then I don't have to open that up. She would then pass it through workflow, letting our responsible leader know that the review is complete. So now this reviewed document would go back to Jeff Bagwell in this particular process so that he can determine if he's ready for this record to move on to the approver. So Jeff Bagwell has the assignment now. I'm going to log out as Beyonce, log back in as Jeff Bagwell. There's my assignment. Jeff Bagwell would review the entire record, looking at the reviewer's recommendations and any comments they have. And when he's ready to send this now for approval, so to that approver, he would then click the icon, assign the record for approvers, of which there could be multiples. One thing I do want to point out of the box functionality, reviewers cannot be approvers and approvers cannot be reviewers. That's out of the box functionality. from Maximo. So now Earl Campbell has the record. I'm going to log out as Jeff, log in as Earl Campbell. There's my assignment. Earl Campbell would come in, check out all of the components of the record to make sure that he wants to approve this record. And if he determines that he wants to approve this record, he would check the box and make any comments. And once he's done that, according to this particular process, he would then let the implementer know that it's ready for implementation. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay here. Now, some organizations have this go back to that responsible leader, but for time's sake, I've taken it to go directly to the person who has been assigned the implementation actions. I think it's a cleaner approach. So Greg Brady now has the assignment in his inbox. I'm going to go to Greg Brady. There's that assignment. My implementation action assignment is there. Once Greg Brady has completed the actual change that this all has been for this one moment, when Greg Brady says, yes, I have made a change to that document updated and uploaded, and sends it on. I also have shortcutted, so from the implementation action, I have the next action going directly to the closer instead of stopping at the responsible leader. We have it going to the closer. It can go either way for your organization. You can certainly put that step back in. Some organizations have it, some do not. So Marsha Brady has that closure assignment. Marsha would come in once all those closure assignments have been performed. Marsha would come in and let us know that she has completed that action. And then once she has marked off as completed, added any comments, anything like that, she would route the workflow to identify that closure actions are completed. And then the record now goes to Jeff Bagwell as the responsible leader, who would then show us, let's see, okay, yeah. So now Jeff Bagwell has that record. So now I log in as Jeff Bagwell, who is that responsible leader. I now know that this record is ready for closure. So as the responsible leader, I would go through, our budgeted cost was $1. And because we planned this action, this change so well, we are right on budget. We are early in our completion of these actions. I would go look at all of the different pieces of information, make sure I have everything attached, make sure all of my related records are up to date, all of my information is good. You could make sure that documentation, we could have a part of the workflow that says attachments must be present. You could also make sure that this documentation attached is checked. Any other actions or closure comments could be made. And then I would identify, this could be auto-populated, myself as closure reviewed by, and any auditing that my organization would require. And then I would click my workflow, close MOC record. So then I would close my MOC record. Notice that it's closed. And now I have the record with the attachments, with the assets, with the actions. I have all of that in one place, and I could easily navigate to any other piece that I needed to if this record were ever audited. So that concludes the demo portion of today's webinar. Russ, over to you.
Good. Well, thank you, Rebecca. That was very informative. We've got, I'm monitoring the questions here, and it looks like we've got a couple of questions. And Jordan, you can tell me if I'm overlooking anything. But Rebecca, between you and I, what I'll do is, for the benefit of the people on the webinar, I'll just read the questions aloud because I'm not sure they can see the questions. Let's see,
Okay.
The first one here is, can the approver/reviewer restrictions, which you just went over in the demo, where approvers cannot be reviewers, can that be overridden?
I would imagine through some configurations in Maximo, we would be able to override that, but that is out of the box functionality. But yes, it could be overridden.
Sure. There you go. So the short answer is yes. And then the second question here is, can you conditionally control the behavior at the field level, or is it at a security group level?
Loving Maximo the way I do, the answer is yes to both. It would depend on what kind of conditions, whether we would do that through something like conditional expression, application, associating a SIGOP with an application field, or if it's at the security group level. There's multiple ways to layer those kind of conditional visibility or conditional read-only across the entire application. Every tab on the application, we could put that kind of conditioning, conditional filtering on.
Okay, very good. That wraps up all the questions that I can see. So I mentioned this earlier, but a recording of this session will be available for those of you who want to share some of this with colleagues, etc. But that'll conclude what we're doing today. For those of you who are golf fans, look forward to watching the Ryder Cup this weekend, and get to bed early tonight because I know you got to get up at 2 a.m. East Coast time to watch it. But everybody have a great weekend, and we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.